When I say the word graffiti, what comes to mind? Is it the world-renowned artist Banksy, who recently attempted to destroy one of his own pieces when it sold for auction? A defiant middle finger to the system of how modern art operates? Or maybe you think of hip-hop, nu metal, electronica. Maybe graffiti to you is intrinsically tied to music, making it an art form that's parasitic of another. Or maybe you think of how graffiti is used as almost a warning to those of rival gangs as they enter large parts of metropolitan cities. In the most vague of terms, graffiti to me is about life, really. It's an evolution of genre that turned from sign to warning to, well, fine art. To me, I think of Jet Set Radio. A video game released in the year 2000, at the turn of the century. I was 10 when this game came out, and hit a nerve that influenced my thoughts and ideas on art, music, and what good aesthetic and form can be. If you don't know, it's a wildly expressive, bombastic inline skating game that has a unique use of color, cel-shaded animation, one of the first, and a unique soundtrack that still rings in my ears to this day. I mean, I've tried for years to find music that could appropriately match Jet Set Radio's youthful exuberance, and barring other productions from the game's composer Hideki Naganuma, I'm left in want. Jet Set Radio is what I think when I think of graffiti, and this video is what made Jet Set Radio great.
Tune in, turn on, rock out.
Now, Jet Set Radio isn't a perfect game. Almost nothing is. There are a lot of people who hold on to things they love with such high regard that they're almost devoid of sin or error. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Ocarina of Time, even newer games like Red Dead Redemption 2 all strike chords in players that say, quote, "This game is perfect," or "This game is a masterpiece." That being said, movement in Jet Set Radio is floaty, which makes precision platforming very difficult. Level design can also feel a bit claustrophobic in some areas, making grinding extremely hard, since momentum is tied to the speed of your grind. The camera can also be a bit wonky at times as well. However, it's been patched in later ports. Jet Set Radio isn't perfect, and it isn't a masterpiece, but it's one of the most influential games of its era, both on a technical and artistic level, and there really hasn't been something as unique since. Jet Set Radio was released June 29th, 2000 in Japan, and October 30th in North America. Europe had to wait an additional month for the release to come there, a feat marred likely by music licensing and localization for the little dialogue and voice work that went into the game. The game was developed by Smilebit, a side studio of Sega, former developers of games like Panzer Dragoon on the Sega Saturn. It's said that the development of Jet Set Radio started because the team was tired of tackling serious fantasy topics and wanted something with a much more grounded pop culture aesthetic. The feeling of what it was like to live in Japan in the late 90s. Lead artist Ruta Ueda was particularly inspired by games of the era, including the infamous Parappa the Rapper. He was quoted by saying, quote, "I think that's the first game with pop culture like that. They did it first. After that, I decided to make a true game, not just a visual experience that was actually for adults," end quote. And that's something that most would agree on. While Parappa the Rapper is related to the hip-hop scene of the 90s and did focus lightly on pop culture, it really wasn't deep in its execution of the components that made it, well, a game. Ueda would also draw on the bleak atmosphere and anti-establishment themes of titles like Fight Club for character motivation. The first of Ueda's drawings included a punk rock aesthetic, a kid with headphones and rollerblades, and that became the foundation for the title. This eventually led to the implementation of the cel-shaded look of the game. Drawing heavily from manga and animation of the day, the cel-shaded technique helped to create an illusion of competence, hiding polygons from the naked eye through cleverly disguised black lines and angles. This technique is one of the sole reasons the game still holds up to artistic merit today. And while yes, the locale, cars, and objects of the world may be lacking, you feel the intended effect through the ages and get that this game is about graffiti, art, music, and style. The settings themselves were built largely on locations familiar to Ueda and the team, Shibuya being a large piece of the game, but there was also stages matching descriptions for places like New York's Times Square and the South Bronx. Due to the game being built this way, it's considered to be one of the first open world games as well, though in comparison to today's open world definition, this is anything but. Still, in 1999, this was a triumph of technical prowess, and the grinding mechanic came from this as well. With a world this large, developers needed a way for the characters to move quickly, since, well, they're on inline skates. But building a large world means programming a lot of collision detection and stuff to interact with. With grinding, you skip all that. and players are given a reward for not taxing the system and receive a cool, aesthetically appropriate gift. However, grinding plays a small part in Jet Set Radio, but it ramped up as a much larger mechanic in its sequel, Jet Set Radio Future, which had entire levels devoted to traversal via grinding. One of the best parts of Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future is the graffiti. It's the primary crux of what you're doing, tagging your hometown or another group's territory for dominance. A lot of the graffiti art featured came from various artists of the era. One of note can be seen doing work for the Beastie Boys and Public Enemy, Eric Hayes. One thing I will say about Hayes and his work is that it's very influential to me personally. The bold lines, simplistic nature, and timeless design really inspire me to this day. I think a lot of his style is actually coming back through again, which is great to see. As you progress through Jet Set Radio, you slowly unlock more and more graffiti. And if you're extra creative, you can even create your own. This is a mechanic I loved seeing as a kid, and something we see coming over into Jet Set Radio Future. But all of this, the world, the aesthetic, the graffiti mechanic, and the traversal mechanic, they all pull the player into the game, creating a symphony of levels that can be enjoyed in its purest form. But nothing is without sound, and the soundtrack is nothing but pure inspiration. Hideki Naganuma was tasked with bringing the pop culture vibe to the forefront even more with an exciting, energetic backing that was heavily rhythm-based and filled with youth and revolt joy. The music needed to feel like a revolution was happening, and that what you were doing went along with that. However, this was a sort of new thing for Naganuma as well, having only 3 real projects under his belt: Atsumare Guru Guru Onsen, JRA Pat, and Sega Rally 2. The 27-year-old had also provided work on Revolutionary Girl Utena as a voice editor as well, but besides that, Jet Set Radio was his first real project as a lead composer for a new intellectual property, and he needed to stick out. Combining various elements of J-pop, hip-hop, funk, electronic dance, rock, acid jazz, trip-hop, and even metal, the arrangement of tracks, some he composed and some he thought would fit the aesthetic the game was going for, was nothing short of a breath of fresh air. Even by today's standards, the soundtrack of Jet Set Radio is powerful, iconic, and something you've likely never heard before or will again. The thumping bass lines, pitched samples, mixed with a heavy reverb or record scratches in between tracks, and the playful electric guitar howling throughout multiple pieces are a feast for the ears. The composition as a whole envelops you in this defiant, youthful vigor that makes you want to just strap on your skates and take on the world. Naganuma nailed the style of Jet Set Radio, and gives an already iconic game even more staying power with this timeless soundtrack. Along with this eclectic soundtrack was a game that fit 2 different modes at the same time. It was the perfect balance of what was thought of as the modern-day level layout comparison, Tony Hawk, and the unusual arcade elements and timing of Crazy Taxi. Traversal in the game was momentum based, and while you do have the usual suspects of half pipes to jump around on and fences to grind on top of, the game really isn't about that. It's more about the graffiti, a system that I really haven't seen repeated to this day. One could say that's a good thing, but it's ingenious on how they implemented it. When you get to spray a wall, a QTE pops up prompting you to carry out a number of analog stick moves in order to correctly spray the wall. This is different for each member of the cast as well, meaning one member might have a relatively easy execution of style, while another might be more confusing, long, but worth it for the points. The reason you might want an easier execution over another is because what you're doing in-game has repercussions. The authorities aren't kind to you, and think of you as a menace. So after a few walls have been tagged, they appear and threaten to take you out. This pressure on top of an already strenuous time limit per level makes the game pretty stressful, even if the NPCs are a bit poor in programming. However, there's nothing like finishing up a wall while you see the police nearing you, and moments before they're on top of you, you're off to hit another wall. It gives this game a defiant energy, something that's echoed level after level. And while the police get exceedingly more ridiculous in their efforts to catch you and stop you, you're still one step ahead of them with your style, speed, and slick moves. All of this comes together to make Jet Set Radio's moment-to-moment gameplay a real treat. You're no longer aimless with how you approach the level, you're confined to a set time, and confined further by how freely you can explore the level each time you finish a tag on a wall. Add to this the ability to gain characters and an unfolding plot, and this game is a wonder to behold. Set in a mishmash of Japan and America called Tokyo-to, you're given instructions and exposition from DJ Professor K, the broadcaster of the pirate radio station Jet Set Radio. He's the primary narrator for the game and the person in the story who informs our characters what's happening in Tokyo-to. You start the game as Beat, a character forming a new game called the GGs, and it's off to the races to protect your town and capture others with turf wars via graffiti. Whether it be the shopping district of Shibuya-cho, the entertainment district, or Koganei Dockyard, each level sees you pitted against an equally interesting gang such as the Love Shockers, Noise Tanks, and Poison Jam. All while this is happening, the authorities are hot on your tail with Captain Onishima at the helm, developing even more ridiculous situations like calling the riot police on you, helicopters, and yes, even tanks. The story begins to unfold into a larger corporate conspiracy about halfway through, when 2 characters from a different town, Grind City, come to you talking about how their city was overtaken by the Rokaku, a sketchy business conglomerate with plans of world domination by harnessing the power of the Devil's Contract, a vinyl record that has the power to summon demons. You're also encountering the Golden Rhinos, a group of elite assassins that do not mess around while you're tagging stages. While the plot does take a turn for the supernatural for a moment, it's discovered that the record was actually just an old indie record with no demonic powers. And it was the fault of Goji, the leader of the Rokaku group, who had been driven insane by power and wealth. The story of Jet Set Radio was really nothing to write home about, so you won't see me talk about it much. However, the story does do a well enough job establishing the rules of the world, and how they can be broken. It's also well suited for the context of a video game of the time, as the levels heighten in difficulty as you go throughout. Sadly, there's nothing to latch onto here though, except for just the faint feelings and aesthetic the world, character designs, and music already give. Youthful defiance. Jet Set Radio Future is basically a retelling of the story, but with the added caveat of including more characters, areas, and music. The differences between Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future are few in concept, but ultimately look very different in execution. Developed for the Dreamcast, Jet Set Radio lacked larger levels that Future became known for, and perhaps due to time constraints in development, Future includes a staggering amount of new characters, some fleshed out, others found strewn about the maps, and a few new story beats that tweak the original into its own plot. There are also way more collectibles in Future, as well as music, levels, etc. Future feels more like what they were going for in retrospect, yet the game has never left its original platform, the OG Xbox, launched in 2002. For a title that's so drastically different, the development time between Jet Set Radio and Future is surprisingly small. The graffiti QTE mechanic was also removed from Future to provide a more streamlined experience, being able to tag walls at high speed rather than stopping and executing QTEs. To me, this changes the push and pull nature of what the authorities in the game represented, and the tension between that and the time limit being removed left a lot to be desired, giving Future a much more lackadaisical feel. While the music and visual style was retained from Radio, Future lost the soul of the moment-to-moment mechanics in search of faster, more streamlined levels, and it ultimately suffers for it. That's not to say it is enjoyable, but the challenge of completing a level is largely lost on you, as you can zip right by any threat and tag a wall to finish out a stage. Both titles, sadly, suffer from technical hiccups. Slowdown, level loading, and frame dropping isn't uncommon, especially on Jet Set Radio rather than Future. However, most of these technical issues have been resolved in later ports and releases. Jet Set Radio could also be described to some as one note, and lacking depth beyond its playful soundtrack and stylistic vision. However, I tend to enjoy the simplicity of its narrative and aesthetic, giving it a very timeless appeal. Future, on the other hand, is much more convoluted due to newer story elements, and without the challenge of QTE graffiti mechanics, the game can come across very simple and easy to beat. That's not to say it's short, it's taken me nearly double the time to complete this rather than Jet Set Radio, but I failed stages zero amount of times and didn't die unless I was being willfully careless. Throughout both titles, the traversal is still regarded as a fun romp, and I can pick up both titles after years of absence and find myself having a blast in either one. I tend to prefer Future's faster mechanics and level layout, alongside its two-player mode and even custom graffiti options. But Jet Set Radio offers a much more true-to-tone experience that the developers wanted. Either title is fun, energetic, and something I recommend you check out. Jet Set Radio is available on a host of platforms, even PC. However, Future's success in this department is lacking, and I hope that Sega one day decides to port this to PC. Jet Set Radio inspired so many in its original release, and while there was a sequel of a type with Future, Jet Set Radio hasn't seen a new entry in its series since 2002, 16 years ago. But that hasn't stopped Sega from including Beat and Gum in various titles like Sega Superstars Tennis, Sonic and All-Star Racing Transformed, and even comics. But again, no new titles. It's almost as if Sega understands the legacy of the property, but hasn't invested in it for fear of financial loss. Regardless, Sony did ask developers in 2017 for a new entry in the series, and indie dev Dinosaur Games stepped up, providing a rough idea of what would be expected in a new series, showing new animations, designs, and aesthetic. Sega ultimately turned down the pitch, but this may cause a chord to strike among Sega executives that now might be the time for a new installment in the franchise. I mean, it's been nearly 20 years. Give us something. Ultimately, Jet Set Radio marks a very important time in Sega's history as a publisher and developer. They were willing to take much more risky moves with intellectual properties and come away with games that no one could have thought of but them. Sega of the late 90s and early 2000s brought classics like Crazy Taxi, Sonic Adventure, Jet Set Radio, Samba de Amigo, Shenmue, and so many others. The library of classics from late Sega Saturn to Dreamcast era from Sega alone is staggering, and a triumph of creativity, motivation to be different, and a willingness to promote platform diversity. In an era where nearly every console has roughly 90% of the same console library, Sega focused on titles that were unique, powerful, and real console sellers. Even their sports games on the Dreamcast platform were considered best at the time. In the end, I love Jet Set Radio. It sets a high bar for creativity in games, with its excellent execution of style and aesthetic. With slightly lacking technical problems and slowdowns that have been fixed since, Jet Set Radio sits atop a pantheon of games that completely capture the essence of an era. The late 90s and early 2000s is Jet Set Radio, and I never want it any other way. And this is what makes Jet Set Radio great. Thank you for watching this. If you like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you love it, and I'll have more videos of this nature in the future. This is my first video essay, so let me know how I did in the comments below. Always excited to hear feedback, and I love you guys. I hope if you haven't played Jet Set Radio to give it a shot. It's available on basically every platform conceivable to man, even smartphones, which is insane. Much love and appreciation. Peace.